Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So this video is going to be on Thatcherism because I'm wearing my Margaret Thatcher t-shirt and I think it's high time I retired this t-shirt. I've had it for 13 years and obviously it's a skit on Che Guevara. At a glance many people assume it is her. You can see complete with is Ernesto Guevara, called the Blighter by his proper name. It's a bit like Mitterrand said that she has the manners of Caligula and the mouth of Marilyn Monroe. That was in the early 80s when Marilyn Monroe was only 20 years dead, so still a sex symbol for some. But this has done sterling service a baker's dozen of years. It might be 13 years probably to the week I purchased it in celebration at something, I shan't say what. But that's good Thatcherite value for money. But I think it's high time it went in the bin. It's faded a bit and you might see this coming off a little bit. It's not like me to throw things out unnecessarily. I'm notorious for my parsimony because, as the late Benny Hill said, you can only wear one shirt at a time. So I don't propose to give you a rundown of the grocer's daughter's autobiography too much. Okay, so born 1926, the year after the Queen, in Grantham, in Lincolnshire. That's more or less in the middle of England. So Grantham's a large town. Only other famous person who ever came there was from Sir Isaac Newton. He came from outside there. Her dad started out working class, left school at 12, started being a shop assistant, saved his pennies, bought his own shop, eventually owned 3 corner shops. So a man who was notoriously good with money, or to put it another way, tight-fisted. As she said, there was little colour or sparkle in her childhood. She only once visited London. She went to Oxford. She read chemistry. So she would have had, presumably, that East Midlands accent, but then affected received pronunciation. At Oxford, she wasn't even allowed into the Oxford Union, which is the debating society, because women weren't allowed in, but she was active in the Conservative Association, standing for Parliament, married a divorced man 10 years older than herself who was very wealthy, Dennis Thatcher. Remember, Margaret Thatcher's maiden name is Roberts. Then she had her twins, Carol and Mark. She was called to the bar. So she was a barrister, that's a lawyer. She'd helped design Mr. Whippy ice cream when she had been a young industrial chemist. Or when she was rejected for a certain job, there was this a report about her which became legendary, saying, "The woman is dangerously headstrong," and so on, which is read out in tribute to her in the House of Commons after she died. And I think it was cited at her funeral. But how about her as an ideologue? Because she's the only British Prime Minister, in the 20th century, besides Blair, to have invented an ism, really. And Blair was obviously the very fag end of the 20th century, only becoming Prime Minister 2.5 years, before the end of the 20th century. So Thatcher obviously was a member of the Conservative Unionist Party. Her father had been a town councillor, an independent, and I think he would have one time been a liberal. So she was a conventional Conservative in many ways, and she was Minister for Education in the early 70s under Edward Heath, the Conservative Prime Minister. And there were very few women in politics at that time. So why did they put her there? Now, it might have been just stereotyping, education, that's children, so woman, yes, women are good with children. I could have that wrong. And what she did was she took away school milk. For 70 years, children were getting free milk at school to help them because some poor families couldn't afford their children to have milk. And so to make sure that they got their calcium, or indeed that some just irresponsible parents would squander money and not give milk to their children. She said, "You don't need this by the early 70s, it's ridiculous." I think maybe not quite right. I think some families still did need it. Anyway, she had actually been in favour of comprehensive schools because there was the 11 plus from the end of the Second World War. You sat an exam at the age of 11. The top 20% went to grammar schools. The lower 80% went to a secondary modern. If you went to a grammar school, you would do grammar, as in Latin, possibly ancient Greek, foreign languages. But you could do hard sciences too. And there was doing O-levels. Those exams you did at 16, ordinary levels, A levels, a few people went to university. Very few people went to university, you've got to remember, in the late 40s. And the lower 80%, they went to a secondary modern, left school at the age of 14, did a bit of English and maths, and woodwork, cooking, or whatever, metal work, practical subjects, no foreign languages, no classics, not much in the mode of hard sciences, might do some. And by the 60s, the Labour government said, no, that's wrong. We have to have a comprehensive system for all levels of ability to merge the grammar schools and secondary moderns together. And she pushed through that policy. So then the Conservatives had lost three out of 4 elections. Well, Heath just lost 2 elections in 1 year. Second one, October 1974. The Labour government of Harold Wilson was back in. So he submitted himself to a leadership challenge in January 1975. And Margaret Thatcher allowed her name to go forward. So she wasn't seen as a very serious candidate, perhaps a stalking horse to bring Heath down and then open the race to the grandees. But if you see the Tories, that series by Alan Clark, he says that a lot of people voted for her because no woman had ever stood for the leadership of any British political party, and it would look abysmal for the party if she got absolutely trashed. But people voted for a few too many people, and she ended up winning. That's January 1975. So Edward Heath went into his sulk for the next 15 years. He remained an MP till 2001. I'll never forgive myself for not going to dinner with him when he dined at Balliol as Auker's guest of honour. I rather disapproved of him. Plus 35 quid was a lot of money to me back in those days in 2002. But when she eventually fell, Heath said, "Rejoice, rejoice, rejoice." So Heath had been a one-nation conservative. Remember going back to Disraeli's book, I think it's Coningsby, said the 2 nations, the rich and the poor. We mustn't have this. The wealthy have got a duty to look after those less fortunate themselves, noblesse oblige and all that, neo-feudalism, so that paternalistic sort of conservatism, and also out of self-interest, the castle is unsafe if the cottage is unhappy, had to meet socialism halfway, believing in Butskillism. Remember Rab Butler, that Conservative Chancellor Exchequer, and Hugh Gaitskell, that Labour Chancellor Exchequer, a blend of the two. And so the policies on economic issues not too far apart. Having a policy on prices and incomes and things like that, and even the national government building houses, not just local councils doing it. A lot of state ownership. Now, Keith Joseph was really Thatcher's guru, and he'd blazed a trail for her, and he would have stood against Heath, but he got himself into bother by making a speech saying that sort of unfit mothers are having too many children, seemed like he was a eugenicist. So he was out of contention, but she had great respect for him. She also admired J. Enoch Poll. Remember, J. Enoch Poll had split with the Conservative Party in February 1974 and actually urged his followers, and there were many, to vote Labour because Labour was committed to bringing the United Kingdom out of the European Economic Union. Thatcher, by the way, was a Europhile at that stage, and Heath was an ardent Europhile, and that was his lasting achievement, well, until recently, bringing the UK into the EEC, which then metamorphosed into the European Union. So Thatcher, she also looked up to some of the capitalist theorists, well, David Ricardo, Adam Smith, more recent times Friedrich Hayek, his Road to Serfdom, how state control is bad and is corrosive of liberty generally, although he didn't seem to mind capitalist dictatorships. So J. Enoch Poll was talking about privatization long before it was fashionable. Remember, the orthodoxy in the 50s, the 60s, into the 70s was that the state should own huge swathes of the economy. There was British Gas, British Telecom, British Oxygen Company, British Home Stores, British Airways, probably must be other things as well. And the government owned these things, British Leyland, and on and on. So all sorts of factories. Obviously, there was the National Coal Board, coal mines, coal being still fairly important back then, that was state-owned. Not to go back to mass unemployment of the 1930s, that would lead to the rise of communism and or fascism. So meant to ensure social justice. But Powell rejected all that. Now, Powell's obviously better known for his 1968 notorious Rivers of Blood oration. That was a tirade against non-white immigration. So Thatcher wasn't with him on that one, but nevertheless she was quite deferential towards him for the rest of his life, and some people said that leaves a very bad taste in the mouth. She should have regarded him as anathema. Now, just because he was dead wrong on immigration doesn't mean he was dead wrong on anything else. He went off to be an Ulster Unionist MP for South Down, and he served till 1986, but the admiration was mutual. Her mettle he admired. So, but in the late 70s, she was a conventional conservative leader, not that sure of herself, and she said there was an ugly streak of contempt for her from amongst the upper class members of the party. They were aware that she came from a humble provincial background, and her voice was too shrill. But a Soviet military magazine dubbed her the Iron Lady. Supposedly this was mocking, but then she embraced that, she relished it, and that became her trademark, which is why there's that biopic about her entitled The Iron Lady. And she quipped about it famously at one after-dinner speech, saying, "I'm standing here in my chiffon gown, the Iron Lady of the Western world." So then she came into office in 1979 and was circumspect at first. The miners organised a strike against her, and she backed down very quickly first time because she wasn't prepared. But obviously things were going to change hugely when she won a resounding victory in 1983 after the Falklands conflict. Re-elected handily, partly because Labour's manifesto was, as a Labour MP, Gerald Kaufman, said, the longest suicide note in history. Just unworkable policies, just like in 2019. So Labour was in disarray. The SDP Liberal Alliance just didn't seem credible to people, so she won by default to some extent. So she became supremely self-confident, perhaps hubristic. But that's when she really started to push through privatisation. She'd come in partly to sort out unemployment. There'd been stagflation in the 70s, the 3-day week, so many strikes, some under Heath, got worse under Labour, and high unemployment. But unemployment was rising under her, and before the Falklands, it was not clear that she was going to win the upcoming election, despite Labour being shambolic under a leader who just wasn't credible, Michael Foot. So after 1983, she was very confident, and when the miners began their strike in March 1984, she was ready. She'd stockpiled coal and all that. Remember, there was about 180 miners in the United Kingdom, coal miners. North Sea oil was pumping. Yeah, there was a bit of nuclear energy as well, but there were some major mining communities, and it had a purchase on Labour's emotions. But she said, some of these mines are worked out. People are having to subsidise them digging up mud. Remember, they're all government employees. She said, we're not going to do this. It's completely wasteful. So the strike went on for over a year. Eventually, she won. All she wanted to do was slim down the mining workforce from about 180,000 to about 160,000. But oh no, Arthur Scargill, the miners' leader, said we won't have that. Incidentally, not all miners went on strike. One of them later became a Conservative cabinet minister because there wasn't a proper national ballot. She said she's not against miners, not against coal mining, but is against employing more than necessary, overmanning. It's wasteful. So she also began this Conservative policy of allowing council tenants to purchase their houses. When she came into office, about 50% of people in the UK lived in council houses. Now it's about 10%. So back then it was a fairly average thing to do. These days we considered poor. Not that that's a bad thing, but some people have disdain for those who are of low economic status. Anyway, so that was very popular. Some people who wouldn't otherwise vote Conservative voted for her. It's popular capitalism, turning everyone to petty bourgeoisie, because then if you own something, even if it's just 1 hectare, even if it's just a studio flat, you've got a stake in that, you want that, you don't want to share it, you hang on to it jealously. They would buy into the whole capitalist system. But eventually privatising more and more things, like British Gas, British Telecom, selling them off, make them much more efficient. That was the idea. It's like Andrew Neil, the editor of the Times, who was pro-Tory at the time, he said, you fly on British Airways and it's monstrously expensive and these services isn't that good. You fly on these airlines in the United States and the American ones are far better and far cheaper. And wait a second, British Airways is owned by the public. It's supposed to be for the benefit of the public, and the great majority of people can't afford to fly on it. This is crazy. Whereas US, it's run for private profit, for the benefit of the owners, and yet it's better for the public. Competition is good for the consumer. So she privatised that, and I know anecdotally from former British Airways air hostesses in the 80s, the salary was better, and they had so many days off, and it was a hoot, but they didn't have any passengers because it was so expensive. But Thatcher said, we're not having that anymore. So selling off shares to loads and loads of people, which Labour opposed. She said the Royal Mail would be a step too far, and she didn't sell off the railways. British Rail, it was actually John Major under her carried on that process. The Labour fought it tooth and nail. It was finished in the dying days of the Major administration in 97. Once Labour came into office, they said they accepted that, which perhaps they shouldn't have done, actually. So that's what it's about, privatisation, and saying that's better. The market will discipline you because you'll produce a better good and service if you have to turn a profit, and also at a reasonable price. Because the trouble is about socialism is you can produce rubbish goods and services and people don't have a choice. There's no alternative. Or you can charge too high a price if you've got a monopoly. So that's wrong. One thing about, obviously, monopolies is railways usually are monopolies. There's only one company operating trains on that line. And maybe there might be another route to your destination, but it's a longer one, or it's by bus, and we want to go by train for some reason. So there isn't real competition there. She got inflation down. That had been a priority, not keeping unemployment down, controversially. I never studied economics, I don't know if that's good. But unemployment under her rose a lot. Crime rose a lot. She was not sympathetic to public transport. We should own a car. As sort of a metaphor for her fairly atomized society. She famously said, when she's asked by some journalists about society, saying there's no such thing as society. There are families, there are businesses, that kind of thing. That was so often thrown back at her. There's no such thing as society, as though we don't have an obligation to the others. So unemployment increased a lot. And also she said some of these people who are in mental hospitals permanently, they're not getting better. Let's have care in the community. Let's let them out. They don't want to be in hospital all the time, drugged up to their eyeballs. But the care in the community is often no care in the community. It led to far more tramps on the streets, and a lot more drug abuse increased hugely. Certain towns became islands of unemployment, former mining towns, for example, and that led to crime and drug abuse and all the rest of it. Crime tripled in the Thatcher major years. So a major failure in her own years. They're supposed to be tough on crime. People said it wasn't good for the family. More people started being born outside marriage. I don't consider that a bad thing, but she did. And she said that she believed in Victorian values. And people said, well, that was terrible because we had, a lot of child labour, child abuse, dire poverty, and all the rest of it. But she said you must mistake Victorian conditions with values. What are the values? By thrift, self-reliance, discipline, a sense of purpose, personal industry, all the rest of it. That's what she lauded, not the fact that there was penury or suffering. And she'd been in favour of raising the school leaving age to 16. But she said there was no accountability in education. That's got to change. Kenneth Baker was her education secretary, partly did that, brought in inseds, which I'll never forgive him. You can be a fairly rubbish teacher and get away with it. Changing the O-levels into GCSEs, General Certificate for Secondary Education, not in Scotland though, and hugely expanding the number of university places. So that was more state. That was more state spending. She wanted low taxes. She'd ended up raising taxes in the early 80s. So some people said her policies were catastrophic by increasing unemployment and therefore crime. And just think of what a waste that is. Millions of people doing nothing, earning nothing, contributing nothing, just absorbing wealth because they've got to eat, but not putting anything back. It was madness, some say. 3.5 million unemployed at one stage. Try not to account people below the age of 20 as unemployed and things like that. There was no minimum wage in those days, remember. And property was so affordable in the early 80s. I used to live in Kensington on De Vere Gardens in 1982. I've looked it up. That's now the 5th most expensive street in the United Kingdom. You'd have to be a multimillionaire to live there. We were a middle-class family who could afford that. It's just unimaginable now. So, and there was a much more of a problem with social housing. Remember, though, obviously the population in the UK was considerably lower. When she came to the office, it was about 50 million. It's now about 70 million. So it's risen for various reasons. So in some ways, she was a small L liberal, hark back to Gladstone, not believing in a minimum wage and not believing in particularly progressive taxes. Minimal state. She said the state does have a role in terms of the armed forces, police, the courts, prisons, things like that. But she did assure people the NHS was safe in her hands. That was sacrosanct. And they were real-term increases in NHS spending. But there's an aging population. There was more drug abuse, more medicines and equipment became available. That's good, but that cost more money and it kept people alive even longer. So she was sort of solving a problem, but in a way making it worse because we live longer. I mean, it was good we live longer, but then this cost was spiraling up and up. And by 1987, the economy the NHS was under severe strain. So this was what her ideology was. Was it consistent? Did it make sense? Was it making life better or not? You say conquering inflation matters more than keeping unemployment down. Difficult to appreciate that if you're one of those who is unemployed. Wanted balanced budgets, never achieved it, and did manage to reduce tax a little bit towards the end. Fairly permissive, not judgmental, not against casinos and so on. The Sun newspaper, the UK's main tabloid, supported her, had page 3, this topless chick on page 3. Thatcher never objected to that. Wasn't against smoking. Tobacco advertising was allowed. And some of these tobacco barons donated the Conservative and Unionist Party. And remember, we had no idea who was funding the party at the time. It all came out later. It was only under Blair that the law was changed, saying that parties had to declare who they got their money from. We had no idea. There were no rules. You could get money from abroad in those days. Labour was quite open about it because they got the money from trades unions. Conservatives were more cagey for reasons that became clear when everything was eventually published. So that was Thatcher's ideology. Thinking it would make things more efficient, making the economy grow more, making people take greater responsibility for their own lives. Does it make sense? I think somewhat. The mass unemployment, I think, was bad news for all sorts of reasons. Could it be done more sensibly, slower? Probably. And what else? Could we have kept inflation down whilst also keeping unemployment down? Possibly. I mean, almost nobody says the state should own all these things that it used to own anymore. So perhaps she was right on that one. Permanently changed things, that Labour came to accept all these things. But she was detested for long periods when she was in office. Like Ben Elton, the comedian, merely had to say Thatcher for the audience to start jeering and whistling. They were approving of his loathing of Thatcher. So she was a hate figure for some, but she was divisive. But she created Thatcherism. She'd inspired blind loyalty in some people. Where she went wrong was right towards the end is the community charge, commonly called the poll tax. That was officially the community charge, but Labour dubbed it the poll tax, and the name stuck, saying that there could be a tax on every adult who was not unemployed or a student. The tax was not exactly the same according to for everyone. There was a slight differentiation for income, but the difference between the tax on the poorest and the richest was not much. Previously, the rates, which was on the property, not on the person. But it was very easy to avoid this tax by getting yourself off the electoral register. So she brought it in Scotland first, where the rates were up for review first. Remember, the Conservative Party was a fairly healthy state in Scotland, even after her time. It was only 1997 that the Conservative Party was wiped out and stayed wiped out for my goodness, well, almost wiped out for about 8 years, and wiped out for about 8 years and almost wiped out for 18 till it came back in a serious way. And then it was extended to England and Wales. I'm not sure about Northern Ireland. So that's what brought her down when she went well behind in the polls. But she believed in no turning back, full steam ahead, and she wouldn't back down. That was her brand. If she gave in, she'd be seen to be feeble and the whole thing would collapse. So often she'd been warned that she was on a disastrous course, but would ply that course nevertheless, was unwavering. Nothing would shake her. A woman of iron will. She was not going to swerve. And that's why she was heading straight towards the rocks. And that's why her own party eventually brought her down. I won't tell the whole story of the fall of Thatcher. So certainly believed in the Union, believed in fighting the IRA, keeping Northern Ireland safe, saving the people of Northern Ireland from terrorist oppression from both loyalists and Republicans, at the same time reaching out to the Republic of Ireland to try and foster better relations, get better security, cooperation. But she felt that the Republic of Ireland had not played ball on that one, and that the Unionist pushback was much more serious than she'd been led to anticipate. That was Thatcher, and a Europhile in the early days, but towards the end of the 80s, beginning to have misgivings about it, that the European Economic Union community was going to turn into the European Union, that the executive, the legislature, the judiciary was all going to be over there. European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, the European Parliament, alternating between Brussels and Strasbourg, and the European Commission to be the executive. No, 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 as she famously said, and giving a speech at Bruges saying, "We've not rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at the European level," beginning to think it was all about overregulation. And it was a bit socialist, and Jacques Delors, a French socialist, was one of its most prominent functionaries, and he's invited to address the Labour conference, who saw him as a kindred spirit. And Labour couldn't win anything in the UK, so it seemed, so they looked to perhaps the EEC to implement semi-socialist policies, the UK having a political consensus which was further to the right of most EU countries. Well, the right is actually that way for me. So increasing Eurosceptic and the exchange rate mechanism coming in, where the currencies of various EE member states pegged to the Deutschmark, which was the most important currency in the EEC, not the highest value. That was the sterling. Should they do that? Should they not? And rowing with her Chancellor Exchequers, losing Chancellor Exchequers over that one. Nigel Lawson, then Geoffrey Howe, and then John Major, Geoffrey Howe, Deputy Prime Minister, who eventually brought her down with his resignation speech in November 1990. And then when the idea of setting up the European Union came forward, she was dead against. She was a backseat driver leading the Maastricht rebels under John Major, Maastricht being the treaty which formed the European Union, and encouraged them to vote against him. And he only got that passed by one vote. The Speaker, almost uniquely in history, had to vote, and he has to vote with whether the government is going. So Wetherell did. Anyway, so that's Thatcher. A strange mix of nationalism and capitalism and 19th century liberalism, but not particularly moralistic. Didn't mind bad language or pornography on television, things like that. Wasn't pro-gay, brought in Section 28. You weren't allowed to teach homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Was dead against communism around the world. Believing that capitalism and democracy went hand in hand, when clearly that's not true. They sometimes go hand in hand. So perhaps dangerously convinced of her own rectitude. Once her mind was made up, was just not willing to listen to countervailing advice. So a fascinating, very different figure. Someone who's very serious-minded, who kind of couldn't really do small talk, was always haranguing people. Not that affable. Who was more liked were people like James Callaghan, but she did have a sense of humour. She's a great showwoman, and the Conservative Conference bringing her feather duster and dusting the conference stage one time, everyone thought that was hilarious. She had a great sense of timing. She was marvellous on her feet, like extemporising when some protester comes in, shouting at the Conservative Party, saying, "It's always better where the Tories are. It's wet outside," getting huge applause like that. So part of her problem towards the end of her time was surrounding herself with smooth-talking flatterers, these very handsome young men, a generation younger than her, the sort of men who, when she was in her 20s or 30s, wouldn't have given her a second glance. So she's too dull, she's a blue-stocking, she's bookish. And the trouble is, they reinforced her prejudices, her belief that her policies were absolutely right, and she would brook no compromise. She had signed the Single European Act in 1986, so she wasn't like a Europhobe or something. She just felt the EEC went a bit too far. Integration had overreached its usefulness, should stop where it was in the late 1980s, no more deeper integration. So that, in no particular order, is a whistle-stop tour through Thatcherism. Toodaloo.